And with that, I'll pass it over to my co-president, Nick, to introduce our professor this evening. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Jackson. Tonight, I have the privilege of introducing our distinguished speaker. Jason A. Grissom is the Patricia and Rhodes Hart Professor of Public Policy and Education at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College. Professor Grissom studies political science, public administration, and economics as it applies to school and district leadership, along with educator mobility and educational equity. He has ongoing research projects on the impacts of school leaders and their decisions on schools. He has published numerous reports and articles, many of which are award-winning. He is frequently mentioned and recognized in nationally based media such as The Atlantic, Education Week, and NPR. Professor Grissom holds a master's degree in education and a PhD in political economics from Stanford University. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Professor Grissom. Thanks for joining us tonight.
All right, thanks for the nice invitation and introduction tonight. And I was excited to see some familiar names on the registration list too. So what I'm going to talk about for the next half an hour or so is what impacts that we're documenting that COVID-19 and the school closures that were a response to COVID-19 have had on kids, but especially on inequities among kids. And I'll note, so one of my jobs at Vanderbilt is I'm the faculty director of the Tennessee Education Research Alliance. So I use the TERA PowerPoint template here. And I'm going to draw a bit on some of the work that we've done in TERA, but I'm going to draw a bit more broadly because we have some ongoing work on the topic, which you'll hear me reference here in Tennessee, but there's a lot of really interesting work. As you might imagine, this is a pretty fast moving area of research. And I'm going to try to pull these sort of disparate threads of research that are sort of coming out every week together to try to tell a coherent narrative here about what we're learning about the school closures and our experience with the school closures and what that has meant for kids. Okay, so I can make the slides advance. So the motivation here is that we know we have big achievement gaps in US public schools by race, by socioeconomic status, by English language learner status, special education status, other student level factors. This figure that you see here in the middle of the slide these are just math achievement gaps by race. And you could do this for reading, you could do this for science, you could do it by income rather than race, you could do it by lots of different cuts here. I'm just showing you one. What these are here, white students are the baseline. They are the zero line that cuts across about 3/4 of the way up there. And then you just have math achievement graphed for Black students, Hispanic students, Asian students, and students from other racial groups. And so just to take the Black students down on the far left, these are Black students' achievement scores from a nationally representative data set called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, which gets used for lots of research on elementary aged kids. And in these data are collected. The students that are in the study are tested beginning in kindergarten all the way through, in this case, 8th grade. And so if you just notice, what you notice if we just focus on Black students there is two things. One, their line is very far below zero. So there's this very large gap between Black students and white students, and also that the line is sloping downward as you move through their schooling experience. So actually the gap is smallest when Black students enter kindergarten, and the gap gets bigger as they move through schooling rather than smaller. You can see the pattern's not exactly the same for the other groups, but just to give you a sense that these gaps are big. Schools aren't in sort of the before times are not always closing the gaps. And what we know is that this year is that COVID-19 has massively disrupted schooling. And so the big question here is this picture getting worse, or will it get worse as we continue to study this in future years? And we don't have answers to that yet that are conclusive, but we do have a lot of emerging evidence, I think, that is suggestive about what the answer to that question is. So that's what I'm going to spend, 30 minutes or so on, is drawing from these, as I said, different strands of social science evidence that the field is beginning to accumulate to try to answer that question of whether or not the picture is getting worse, that equity picture is getting worse or not. And I won't be comprehensive. Most of this, a lot of this research is ongoing. As I said, new things come out every single week. And I'm going to draw a bit on some of the work we've done here in Tennessee, but also, again, try to paint a bit of a national picture of what we know here as well. All right, so this is just by way of background. This is a quick timeline just to show that the first COVID cases in the United States emerged at the very end of January 2020. It was just a few weeks later that there were any temporary school closures. Those happened in Washington and New York. At the end of February, so about a month after the first cases began to appear, the CDC sort of put out guidance to schools and said, hey, this doesn't look great. You should start to prepare for potential shutdowns. And schools started closing down pretty quickly after that. So as of March 11th and 12th, the number of students who had been affected by closures hit 1 million. That was also on March 12th, Ohio became the first state to just say we're closing buildings statewide. And within 2 weeks, all US public school buildings had been closed. Idaho was the last to do that. And so when Idaho made that closure decision on March 25th, that closed down essentially all US public schools. So the point here is it was a really fast, I mean, everybody remembers this, right? Like it was a very quick, it was sort of from learning that there was even maybe going to be a problem to all schools closing was less than 2 months. And so schools had to pivot very quickly. They didn't have a lot of time to plan. And so they were often relying on what their sort of existing resources were to try to pivot to doing something. All right. And so we can think about then there being sort of 3 phases of the pandemic for schools. So, and here they are. So the first one is this late spring 2020 period. So what was happening in sort of the March, April, May, even into June period where schools had closed, all schools had closed by the end of March, but there still was schooling left to be done. Most schools in the United States, are getting out mid to late May into early June. So that's sort of the first phase. And we know a fair amount about that phase. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that. Then you've got the fall 2020 phase and then the spring 2021 phase. And I separate those because we actually have more data about fall 2020. Spring 2021 is just now ending, right? So we don't know a lot about what's been happening in spring, but we know we're starting to accumulate some insight into what was happening in the 2 earlier periods. All right. So let's take this like this spring 2020 period. So governors were the ones who were closing schools here. Like they were saying statewide, all schools here are going to close. As a result, is what we know about spring 2020 is essentially no kids were learning in person. Okay, there was essentially no in-person schooling happening, but it was really different beginning in the fall because most governors ceded reopening decisions to local governments. And so even within state, you could get a lot of heterogeneity in what kinds of decisions were being made about what kinds of schooling modes were being offered. And so you have this issue where local school boards are making different decisions about whether to offer in-person options versus hybrid options versus remote options. So whether those options were available was one question. And then the second question is, well, what do families decide to do? Because families then have to make decisions. If they're offered something, then families have to decide what they want to take advantage of. Do they, you could have in-person options, but maybe you also have a remote option. You have to decide, do I want to go in person or do I want to stay remote? And so as a result, you get a lot of variation this school year. So in 2020, not much variation, everybody's out. But throughout this school year, the fraction of kids that has been learning in person has changed. And in fact, it's been getting more and more over time as we've gotten the virus more and more under control. In particular, more and more kids are going back in person. Now, some of those kids are going back in what we call a hybrid model, meaning they're partly remote and they're partly in person, but you have more kids that are in school buildings, certainly now in May 2021, than we had at the beginning of the fall. And so there's a lot of variation there that we want to try to understand. And so what we're interested here is the mode of instruction. So were kids in school buildings or were they learning remotely, that typically, via computer? And what I'm really going to focus on is what we've learned about how mode of instruction, what kids were, whether kids were going in person or not, what that has meant for their achievement. And what's really important here is that there's a lot of different factors that can affect the link between mode of instruction and achievement. And I'm going to dig into those a bit. So that's going to be this, the point here is like, you could be learning remotely, but that can mean lots of different things in different places, right? What remote learning means gets defined differently in different school districts. So that's going to be a piece of the puzzle here. But just to acknowledge that other outcomes that we care about besides achievement, right? So a big one is health outcomes. Parents' perceptions of what the risks of sending kids back in person is a big driver of whether or not parents did that, right? And so we care a lot about what maybe were the health impacts on kids of going back in person. Another one is we might care about other kinds of outcomes like socio-emotional outcomes. Do kids feel connected to one another? Did they, what was their social development like, and so forth, right? And we care about that as a different set of outcomes. And moreover, we might care about health and socio-emotional outcomes because they could also impact achievement, right? If you get sick, it's harder for you to learn. If you don't feel attached to schools, if you don't feel like you're, making friends and so forth, it might make it harder for you to learn math and reading. All right, but I'm not going to talk about those things as much just for time. I'll touch on a couple of pieces. I'm going to focus on achievement instead. And what I'm really going to spend the rest of the time talking about is that over this time span from the late spring of 2020 through the present, kids' experiences have been very different. And it's what kids have gotten has varied a lot from place to place. And in particular, those experiences, you're going to hear me use the phrase opportunities to learn. So did kids get rich opportunities for them to be able to learn academic content? And there's going to be a lot of variation in that. And that variation presumably affects what their academic outcomes look like. And that's what we're going to get to, right? And so I'm just going to sort of plow through, but certainly, as we already noted, if you have questions, stick them in the chat and we'll come back and pick up hopefully answers to your questions at the end. All right, so let's start with the spring 2020 period. So what do we know about the effects of those spring 2020 school closures? All right, so the first thing is that there's some challenges in trying to document these effects. One just logistical one is a main way that we have to, main means that we have for knowing about kids' achievement is achievement testing, and states canceled that, all right, because schools were letting out. So we don't have statewide achievement tests to be able to look at kids' achievement in spring 2020, and that's just sort of a logistical problem. Another problem we have is that despite in these closures, there being this large variation in what schools and school districts did, what they offered kids, we didn't undertake any kind of comprehensive national effort to document that. So there was no sort of government-led effort to try to say what schools were doing, what schools were offering remote instruction of what type. Was it was it computerized? Was it people sending hard copy packets home? I mean, we don't have any comprehensive way of knowing that. And so what researchers have had to do is get creative. They've had to collect data on what schools were doing and also on student and family experiences from other means. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how people have tried to piece that together. But the main conclusion from the research that has been done on kids' experiences during this time was that what kids got when they weren't in school, and remember, nobody was in school in person, right? But they were getting different things at home, and what they were getting when they weren't in school in person was correlated with these factors that we care about, like race and poverty. And we're going to focus on some school level responses to the closures and also some family level ones that I'm going to demonstrate, I think, are going to contribute to some of these inequities that we're going to be worried about. All right, so two different kinds of data sources. So one big data source here is surveys. So we can do surveys of parents, we can do surveys of teachers to try to find out, what are schools offering and how are families experiencing that. And so there have been national surveys of teachers and parents that have been run. There have been localized ones, at state or school district level, but that's sort of one source of data. Another source of data that I draw on, there's kind of this really in-depth data collection effort that was led by some researchers at Tulane, where they had the insight that, hey, to communicate with families, schools are going to have to put on their websites a lot of information about schooling options and what the school is offering. And so we could go scrape websites and code them for to learn about what schools were doing during that time. And so this team of researchers, they basically grabbed information from school and district websites and a nationally representative sample, a really large sample, in the May to June 2020 period, and then coded them. And so we have lots of information from that data effort about what schools, at least, were saying they were offering at that time. And so what do we learn from sort of looking across these different kinds of data sources? Well, first, we learned that students from low-income families had lower engagement with virtual resources. When you ask parents from high-income versus low-income families, low-income kids just weren't being offered virtual resources during this time at the same rates. Teachers would say the same things. Teachers would say, virtual schooling options like meeting in online classes, for example, that was happening less regularly in high poverty schools. And then from this Tulane study, one of the conclusions there, they had a way to try to measure the quality of offerings because they were coding websites for things like how personalized were instructional offerings that the school made available. Were teachers monitoring kids' progress? Were they doing things like taking attendance, grading assignments? In a lot of places, my kids' school included, attendance was not being taken, assignments were not being graded, and so forth. But in some places it was, and what those researchers found is that though when you sort of combine those different aspects together into an overall quality metric, you find that the quality of the offerings during that spring 2020 period were higher in schools where parental education in particular was higher. So, where more educated parents presumably were advocating and had better resources, were trying to push schools to offer their kids more. And that's what that research suggests. So I could put a lot more on this slide, but there's a general sense that higher income families, better families whose with parents that are better educated and located in some specific places were more likely to have options made available to kids that created these higher quality opportunities to learn. So a big factor in this place question is broadband access, because if you're going to move everybody to virtual learning, then and you're going to do that through learning apps, learning management systems, other kinds of software, then kids got to be able to access it, right? And broadband access then becomes essential. In a lot of places, broadband access is very uneven. So this is from some research that we've done in Tennessee, but people see things in other research using different data sources as well. So this in Tennessee, this is a scatter plot by school district. On the x-axis here are the percent economically disadvantaged students, and on the y-axis is broadband subscription rates from the American Community Survey. And you can see a pretty clear downward slope here, and it's especially pronounced among those rural districts, the red ones, that as the fraction of kids in a school district becomes the fraction of kids in poverty in a school district gets higher and higher, their access to broadband gets lower and lower, right? In other words, poor kids have less access to broadband internet. Why does that matter? That matters because when we surveyed teachers in Tennessee and we asked them about what offerings they had in their classrooms during this April and May period, let's just focus on the far right. When we asked teachers, are you holding virtual classes or virtual tutoring sessions? That was a function of what the broadband access was like in that school district. Those lines are upsloping. So broadband access is on the x-axis. And you can see the middle one, whether or not they sent electronic learning resources home, was also a function of whether or not kids could access that. What's interesting, we also ask about physical resources. It's also upsloping there, which is just to say, like, kids who had more broadband access were getting more of everything. They were getting more physical stuff. They were also getting more electronic stuff. They were having more opportunities to engage with their teachers in these virtual classroom settings. That was a function of where they lived and whether or not broadband was available to them. When we asked teachers on the survey, by the way, we asked them a bunch of questions about their needs, resource needs, what was preventing them from being able to teach well during this period. And then we did some natural language processing on the responses. Teachers were a lot more likely to mention internet and technology related words in school districts where we could see that broadband access was low. So that's just to say that there's a big infrastructure difference across school districts. It's especially in low income rural areas where kids just didn't have the means to be able to engage in presumably higher quality instruction in these sort of virtual class and tutoring environments. And that was a big barrier, given that infrastructure wasn't there and people had to pivot so quickly early in the pandemic. So school districts tried to do some stuff about this. So for example, when we look at continuous learning plans in Tennessee, what school districts reported to the state that they were trying to do some strategies they were trying to implement to overcome some of the challenges they faced. School districts would do things like quite a few school districts did things like provide hotspot access. So they would either distribute hotspots to kids, or they would set up mobile hotspots, maybe like in a public park or something, so that kids could come there and do with their laptops and engage in their schoolwork. But those districts that were doing that weren't districts where broadband rates were low. In other words, this was a case of sort of the rich getting richer. Places that already had this access were the ones that were distributing hotspots. The low-income districts didn't have the resources to be able to do that, so they weren't able to ameliorate this problem for kids. Okay, so that's just to give you a sense of some of the structural challenges facing schools. You also can see some evidence that how families responded to these school closures in spring 2020 might also have helped contributed to these inequalities, particularly between high-income and low-income kids. So there's this really cool study. It's one of my favorite studies that has been done on this period that analyzed internet search behavior in the April 2020, in the month, basically April 2020, the first month following these big school closures. And so what they did is they identified keywords that were associated with resources that parents could use for teaching kids at home. So these were words like these were parents going into Google and searching for Khan Academy, or searching for the phrase math worksheets. All right, so these are presumably parents who are trying to figure out something to do for their kids who are now at home with them, right? And then they use Google Trends to capture this search intensity and match that to geographic data. So Google will tell you like frequency of search terms. They make that available for research purposes. And so this is here is a graphic that shows you weeks beginning in September 2017 and running all the way through this period, where the vertical line there in March 2020 is where schools started to close. And then the y-axis here is just search intensity. So how frequently were people looking for these terms? And you can see the big jump after March. Like suddenly there was a lot more people searching for Khan Academy or searching for math worksheets or Class Dojo or these other kinds of programs that parents could use to supplement what kids were maybe not getting now that they were home. And what's really interesting is that when they match that to geographic data, they see that that jump is concentrated in high socioeconomic status areas, and also in more urban areas and areas that have better broadband. So that makes sense, right? Like if you don't have broadband access, you're not going to search for Khan Academy because you have, well, A, you'd have trouble searching for it, but B, you'd have trouble getting your kid to be able to engage with it, right? Because you don't have broadband access. And so this is an example of sort of the family response here that the conclusion that the authors draw is that high income families, families in urban areas were doing probably a much better job trying to supplement when kids weren't getting a whole lot during this spring period. High SES parents were providing something at home, and low SES parents presumably were able to do much less. They also provide this kind of suggestive analysis in the paper. They look at search intensity and they correlate it with the change in math progress on Zern, which is a popular math learning app that is in widespread use. And they basically, this is all just a correlation. It's just sort of suggestive, but I think it's interesting here. Where parents were searching more, kids were also progressing more in this particular app, which is just a way of saying like these things are probably going hand in hand. Parents are trying to, some parents are trying to invest in their kids' learning, or able to invest in their kids' learning at home as a means for offsetting what was happening at school, and maybe some suggestive evidence that that was paying some kinds of dividends. All right, so the point here, schools were doing different things, families were doing different things. There's a lot more that could be said about that. So what are we learning about what the effects of those differences in that spring 2020 period, what have they meant for achievement? Well, we don't have a ton of data here because again, we don't have tests from spring 2020, but we can draw on some evidence from a couple of places. So, and I'll just show you one, well, I'll show you two of these. So one is a study from Ohio. So Ohio is a convenient place to look here because Ohio has fall testing, which is unusual. And so what they were able to do is these authors were able to look at differences in kids learning from fall 2019 to fall 2020, just as a means of trying to measure what these differences might have been. And what you can see on the left there is that's the percent of students in third grade. The third grade reading assessment, ELA, is English Language Arts. This is the percent that were proficient. And you can see there's this, it's a big drop. So the kids who are, you would expect, the fall 2020 percentage to be roughly the same as the fall 2019 one. But the kids who were taking in fall 2019 had missed this big chunk of schooling. And so the fraction who were proficient went down. On the right, these are changes in scale scores, just another way of looking at this broken down by race. Negative is bigger drops. And you can see it's negative for everybody across all racial groups. Kids did worse in fall 2020 than would have been predicted. But that was especially true of Black students. They did much worse in the fall. And in fact, the average loss for overall students was a third of a year of learning, which is quite big, but it was half a year for Black students. So it was even larger for Black students than it was for the average kid. So that's just a way of starting to begin to quantify that what happened when kids were sort of pushed out of school during spring 2020 maybe had negative impacts on their achievement, which is what you would expect if school matters, right? We can also look at evidence from NWEA, that is a testing company. They have this MAP assessment that's in pretty widespread use. It's not in a random sample of districts. The districts that use it tend to be a little larger, a little more urban, but it is used in lots of districts. It's what we call a formative assessment. So it's not used for high stakes purposes, but it's used, school districts use it to track student progress throughout the year. And the typical case is districts will administer it in fall, winter, and spring. And so what this is a comparison of students taking MAP between fall 2019 nationally and fall 2020. And what's nice, what's a sort of positive here is that the reading lines, so the sort of coral colored ones are fall, and the teal one of 19 and the teal ones are 2020, broken down by grade. And so when you look at reading, what you see is the lines are very similar. And that's giving people some, there's some hope that maybe kids didn't drop as much in reading as we might have worried that they did. But you can see that there are these pretty big drop-offs in math. They're 5 to 10 percentile points lower in fall 2020. And that's worrying. Kids were like losing ground in math over this time. You can break this down by high poverty versus low poverty schools, and the gaps are bigger in high poverty schools than they are in low poverty schools. And in fact, when you look just at high poverty schools, you start to see some differences in reading, that kids were actually reading, their reading achievement was lower in this fall than it was in the prior fall. But these drops in math are even more substantial than they are in other kinds of schools. So again, reinforcing this concern about equity. Okay, so that's sort of what we know about the spring 2020 period. Again, there's a lot more that could be said here, but I want to touch on what we know about what's been happening in this school year as well, to round the picture out a little bit. All right, so this is, what do we know about, sort of what's been happening in the fall 2020 to spring 2021 period. So the first thing is, as I noted on the earlier slide, the fraction of kids learning in person has been increasing over this school year. But who these children are who are coming back in person, those children aren't random, all right, for similar kinds of reasons to what we saw earlier, all right? And there's a couple of different reasons for this that I think are interesting, so I want to dig into this a little bit. So the first thing to know is that these reopening decisions that local school districts were making, they were determined by politics and geography. So where you lived and sort of what the politics and other characteristics of the school district that you live in were. So this is a really interesting analysis from Hart and Finger. This is just showing you, on the x-axis is the Trump vote share in 2016. So as you move to the right, more and more people in that county were voted for Donald Trump relative to Joe Biden. On the y-axis are the percent of students who were attending school in person in fall 2020. And you can see there's a really steep upsloping line. In other words, in districts that were more heavily Republican, where people were more likely to vote for Donald Trump, they were also a lot more likely to go back in person. And you can look at that in a lot of different ways. And that's a result that holds up pretty clearly across studies, that more conservative areas were more likely to send kids back in person. But there are other kinds of predictors also. So district size is a big one. So larger districts were less likely to have in-person schooling in fall 2020. That certainly was the case here in Tennessee. In Tennessee, there are 147 school districts. All but 2 of them basically went back at the beginning of the school year, but the 2 that didn't were Memphis and Nashville, the 2 largest ones, right? But some other predictors are median income in the district. So wealthier districts were more likely to go back in person. The fraction of kids in that school district who were white was a big predictor of going back in person. And another interesting one is the presence of Catholic schools in the area. And that's the one interpretation of that is it's something about competition. If you know that there are more options for people to leave the public school system and people want to go back in person, then you're more likely to offer in-person schooling. So another kind of interesting thing here is that districts with teacher collective bargaining agreements were more likely to stay fully remote. So if the teachers union had a lot of power, had the capacity to be able to bargain with the school district to ensure that teachers' health and safety was prioritized, those districts were less likely to go back in person. And then the final sort of interesting thing here is that COVID case rates were a lot less important of a predictor than these other political factors. So it's not as, school districts might have been worried about COVID. Certainly they were worried about COVID, but their worry seemed to be driven a lot more by political considerations, is sort of where the research is landing here, than really driven by the actual threat of COVID in that local school district. That's at least an interpretation here, all right? And so in particular, since median income and the fraction of white students is correlated with whether or not in-person schooling was offered in a school district, then what that means is that Black and low-income students in urban areas were less likely to be offered in-person schooling, all right? So they're less likely to be offered in-person schooling. And actually, there's also research that shows that even when that in-person option was offered, that Black families in particular were more likely to choose remote schooling. And the reasons for that are that's something that people are really interested in trying to document. Lots of possibilities, like the fact that COVID was disproportionately impacting Black families, and so there was justified fear of sending kids back in person and exposing them to the virus. But the sort of punchline here is that Black students in particular were a lot more likely to be in remote learning options, and we worry a lot about the quality of remote learning, which is going to be sort of a concerning factor here in this equity conversation that we're having. There are a couple of other ways of cutting this. This is from a survey by Education Next, a national survey that was done in November and December of 2020, so sort of late fall, asking parents what about the instructional model that their kids were experiencing, and looking at whether or not kids were back in person, whether they were totally remote, or whether they were hybrid, meaning maybe they went in a couple of days during the week, but then they were remote the rest of the time. And so what the patterns here show you is that as of late fall, low-income students and students of color were more likely to be remote. All right, so you can see that remote bar is the highest for Black students and for Hispanic students. It's the highest for low-income kids. It's much higher among families who say that they are Democrats versus families that say that they are Republican, which has a lot to do with the political factors and geography that I talked about just a second ago. So that's one big finding here. The second one here, so the second part of this graph shows the share of students who are choosing in-person instruction among those that have that option. And what you can see, focus here sort of on that middle set where it's looking at race. And what you can see is that Black students essentially are much less likely to choose in-person when that option is offered than white students or even than Hispanic students. And then the last finding here, the last way they cut the data here is to look at public schools, like sort of traditional public schools run by school districts, private schools, and charter schools. And you can see that district schools, like these traditional public schools and charter schools, look pretty similar to one another, but they look very different from private schools. And in particular, the majority of private school students were attending in person, even when their neighbors in the public schools were saying, we are not attending in person. Just these big differences in remote offerings versus in-person offerings between public schools and private schools. And We know what are the differences on average in kids that are attending public schools versus private schools. So again, sort of the options offered to kids in private schools versus public schools are going to make us worry about the inequity problem. One last thing here is on this survey, they asked parents how satisfied they felt with the instruction their kids were getting. And the kids, regardless of whether they were in public school or private school, if they were in person or if they were in private school, the parents were more likely to report being satisfied with instruction. And they were also less likely to say they saw negative impacts on their kids' learning this year relative to earlier years, which is, again, sort of contributing to this idea that parents at least perceive that in-person learning was better than hybrid and remote options. And that was from nationally representative data. Okay. If we advance just a little bit more, so now we're getting really close to the present and look at what kids' attendance look like. By March, half of schools were open full-time for face-to-face classes, but there's still these big racial gaps. And so you can see that even as of March 2021, 58% of Black students were essentially 100% remote, 56% of Hispanic students, compared to only 27% of white kids. And so just the differences in what kids were experiencing, it was really different even as of 2 months ago, and has continued to be really different here at the end of the school year. All right, so sort of conclude here by talking about what's the impact of being fully remote. Well, it's hard to say, right? Because we haven't even ended the school year yet, but the early signs are not good. So when you look at that Ohio study, they were able to make comparisons between kids in schools that were remote versus in person. And what they found is that the fall to fall losses, remember that was the one that looked at fall 2019 compared to fall 2020 in kids' proficiency. Those fall to fall losses were larger among kids who were remote than among kids who were in person. All kids lost. You can see that on the left. Even the in-person kids were 7.5% less likely to be designated as proficient in third grade reading. But if you were fully remote, that fraction was up 12%. There was a 12% drop. So much larger among the fully remote kids. Another study, recent study looking at the Atlanta metro area, arrives at some similar findings, but finds some variation across the grades. So you can see that the gold bars are among kids that are 0% remote, and they had sort of the largest scales, the highest scale scores, especially in 4th and 5th grade. The orangish ones that are the 90 to 100% remote, those are kids who are basically remote all the time. They were never in person. And those kids had much lower gains. Like you can see grade 4, their gains were only half as large. And, you might wonder why these are, why you find those patterns. So one is that possibility is that the quality of remote options is just much lower. And I think we worry a lot about that kids especially kids in early grades, it's just much harder for them to learn in a remote environment than in an in-person environment. But related to this, in a study that we've been doing at TERA in 6 Tennessee districts, we've also found that there were really large spikes in absenteeism and chronic absenteeism among virtual learners. So meaning kids just didn't show up for sort of virtual learning. Maybe they didn't like it. Maybe it was challenging for them to access it because of technology issues. For whatever reason, we just see that kids are less likely to do it. Kids are a lot more likely to show up in person, and showing up is a precondition to be able to learn anything, right? Regardless of what the mode is. And so to sum up, so we see that these kids from historically disadvantaged groups, they had fewer opportunities for academic instruction, either in person or what families were providing for them at home following those spring 2020 school closures. When school resumed in fall 2020, those students generally were less likely to be offered in-person options that we generally think are likely to be higher quality. When they were offered them, they were less likely to take them. And since we assume that in-person schooling, I think there's a lot of, certainly the quality of remote options is going to vary a lot from place to place with how the district has, or even teachers invest in managing it. So this is a generality that won't apply to everybody, but on average, that in-person schooling seems from the available evidence to be the most likely to lead to better learning outcomes. And so kids from marginalized groups are getting less of those in-person schooling options that we think are high quality. And so to go back to the question on my title slide, has the pandemic reinforced existing inequities in student learning? It sure looks like it. All right, so there's a lot for us to worry about here. We do have some options. I think we're going to need targeted supports for students falling behind. So when kids, especially now, you're sort of wrapping up the school year, we've got to figure out what to do this summer or what to do as schools reenter, presumably at much higher rates in person in fall. And so districts are doing things like creating summer learning opportunities. So summer school is going to be a much bigger deal this year than it has been in prior years. As kids are going back in the fall, there's going to be a big push, I think, for districts to implement tailored supports and interventions. In other words, try to say, well, the data are telling us that these kids are the furthest behind. Let's target interventions, specific to math or reading, or specific needs in math or reading for those kids. There's a lot of evidence that high dosage tutoring really can move the needle. Districts have started that already this school year, but can continue that through the summer and into next year. Extended learning time, like just making the school day longer, adding additional instructional days. So the point is that there are tools in school districts, toolboxes that can help address these inequities, but they're going to have to do something because kids lost a lot of learning time. They lost lots of learning opportunities here, and it's going to be important for school districts to try to address that. I mean, fortunately, at least the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, that we call ESSER, that's part of the CARES Act, so it's a big part of the stimulus essentially. The Biden administration has set aside $13.2 billion for school districts to help address these needs. So they get 3 years to spend those funds, so school districts everywhere are putting together ESSER plans now to figure out what are they going to do. They're short-term funds; they don't last. You just get them for a few years, but what can they do in this period to try to ameliorate these learning losses, particularly among kids from disadvantaged groups? And as I said, there are some tools. They're expensive, but the federal government is giving local school districts some money to try to implement those responses. And that's what I got. So I'm excited to see what your questions are, and thanks for your attention for the last 30 minutes or so.
That was fascinating, and I think we're all extremely thankful that we have organizations like TERA and leaders like yourself to help guide us through some of these challenging times. So we do have a couple questions in the chat box. One from Say, as more states are now trying to make up for the loss of learning and achievement testing that happened as a result of the pandemic, do you know of any particular examples that certain states are doing that seem promising for the future?
I mean, every state has plans in place, and then within states, school districts are getting a lot. School districts are also sort of building off of state plans and trying to sort of tweak for their local context. I don't know that I think it's just too early to know what states are doing that might be promising just yet, because a lot of those plans are still unfolding. I do think when we look at the research evidence on what can you do to intervene with kids to try to ameliorate, however you want to describe it, gaps, learning loss, this kind of COVID slide, people are sort of giving it different names. I think the biggest probably bang for your buck that people are likely to get is through small group intervention. So tutoring services, high quality tutoring with trained people in small groups is one intervention that has a lot of good research evidence behind it. And we see lots of evidence of either school districts trying to implement that themselves or to work with nonprofits to make that available to families. And I think there's going to be a lot of interest from researchers and people like me of trying to figure out what worked in the coming months. But there's just going to be a lot of variation in what states plans look like and what district plans look like that will give us an opportunity to do some of that good work, I think.
So I have a follow-up to that. I'd imagine there's plenty of members of the Vanderbilt community who would love to get involved with tutoring. Do you recommend that non-teachers attempt to get involved, or is it best to kind of let experts help out?
No, I don't think it. I don't think. I mean, the short answer is I think, yeah. I think smart people being involved, volunteering their time to do things like tutor is great. In fact, Vanderbilt had a tutoring corps this year. Vanderbilt undergraduates there was this effort to work with Metro Nashville Public Schools specifically that Vanderbilt students were trained and to be involved in that tutoring effort. I think that's going to continue into next year as well. And so, yeah, I don't think, I don't think there's any, it's not that there's no special expertise that is required. I think people, it is helpful to have training, and most organizations that are doing this seriously will provide that. But a lot of the, certainly, anybody who's going to be on this webinar is going to have, the basic skills to be able to teach a lot of the material, like to young elementary aged kids that they just literally haven't been exposed to. And so, if you have the opportunity to sort of give your time to volunteer, to help a local school district or local school out on that front, I think anybody would be excited to have that help.
That's great. Yeah, I think back to my undergrad experience, and there was a program called the After School Program where students would go and tutor kids, and that was a ton of fun. So would love to get involved again. I believe for now, that's all the questions we have. Maybe we'll give people just a few more seconds to add anything before we close out for the night.
While we're waiting, Nick, I have a couple, if you don't mind, Professor. So my first one is just around clearly, in addition to, one of the many facts I think you highlighted for me is just how different the state by state response has been over the past year to COVID. And I feel like I knew that, but seeing it, in your presentation on a page, really made it hit home. Do you feel like there are conversations happening right now that are suggesting that due to this very varied response, for lack of a better term, it necessitates a conversation about maybe making some aspects of our educational system more standardized at the national level?
It's a good question. It's sort of a perennial question in public education, is the degree to which you concentrate authority at the local level, where presumably can be better insight into what local needs are, and can allow local school boards or schools to vary their offerings to meet those local needs, or whether you concentrate authority at higher levels of government, like the state or even the federal government, to try to standardize, right, will help address inequities, because now you take away the power to make those decisions. So now, high income school districts are not going to make, not going to direct huge resources towards kids, and low income school districts not be able to do that in the same way, or make different decisions that maybe don't advantage kids in the same way. So, I think there is the possibility that, certainly with the federal government getting involved with ESSER with this huge cash infusion, that is an example of the federal government sort of stepping in. On the other hand, they haven't, the guidelines that have been given still give local school districts a lot of leeway. So I think there's the possibility that raises that question, brings it to the fore even more than it was there already. On the other hand, we just have a real stance in public education in the United States that those decisions are best made at the local level, whether or not they actually are. People really believe that. When I teach this in my class, I teach a class on the politics of policymaking in education, and we refer to this as the ethos of local control. Like, people really, really believe in this idea that these decisions are best made at the local level. But I think we also have a long history of inequality and recognizing that intervention at higher levels of government is a way to address inequality. And so, I don't see those conversations bubbling up just yet, but I think there's lots of potential for the losses, the disproportionate losses from COVID to push that conversation. So a good question.
Great, thank you. And I have one more while we give folks maybe 1 or 2 more minutes to answer. So I feel like, when you illustrated, the vast gap that exists between, the top and the bottom, my hope, or the assumption, I guess, is that, the students that come from the top SES levels are going to be okay because their parents can provide things like tutoring and all the other stuff you talked about. Those at the bottom, we would hope, would be somewhat buoyed up by the federal stimulus money and like other things like tutoring, like Nick talked about, like, other methods of intervention. So do you worry about kids in the middle at all? Like, do you worry, like, over time, like, will they be the ones that like end up getting left behind in some sense? Just thought I'd ask that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I still think I worry the most about the kids at the bottom, even though they're going to be the ones that are targeted by the dollars, because they are just the ones that for whom schooling matters the most. And you're right, like high income kids, it's a little flippant to say high income kids are going to mostly be fine, but they have lots of other resources outside school that that provide them with opportunities, right? And that sort of reinforce their, often a steep upward trajectory throughout life. And just the context for as you move down the socioeconomic status spectrum, the context changes a lot, and it's much different. Those kids in high poverty schools, in challenged school districts, they are going to be the ones that have the most access to funds through ESSER, other kinds of interventions. I think the bigger concern is that it just isn't going to be enough. And I think that's going to be, it's so much money. And I think people have kind of high hopes for how the money can be spent. On the other hand, the investment has to be used for things that are non-recurring. And so it's not as if that money can be used to permanently purchase better teachers, higher quality teachers, or permanently reduce class sizes, or, it's got to be spent on things that are sort of temporary and like by construction. And so we're going to do things for kids for 3 years, and then hopefully that will be enough that we can get them in that 3-year time frame. We can sort of get them back to where they might have been. I think the big concern is that even with that big resource infusion, we just won't be able to do that. We'll see. I think there's cause for optimism. It's good that there is this big resource infusion. We'd be much worse off without it. But also, these are not permanent funds. Our schools, public schools, particularly serving kids that are high needs already, don't have enough resources as it is. And this isn't, a sort of long-term fix there. But it's an open question. We'll have to track it going forward.
Makes sense. Thank you so much.